All right, welcome to the Week 11 Forum. This week we are looking at the intelligence agenda and the intelligence community's focus on nation states. As I noted in the interview, for the first 42 years of the intelligence community, its focus was consistently directed primarily at the Soviet Union and its allies, and its priorities were largely informed by a consistent grand strategy known as containment. The origins of containment lie in the thought and works of George F. Kennan, who was a key State Department official at the start of the Cold War. At one point, he was the first director of policy planning, which was the State Department's think tank, if you will. He wrote the famous X article in 1947 in an edition of Foreign Affairs and concluded that the main element of any U.S. Policy towards the Soviet Union must be a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Soviet pressure against the free institutions of the Western world is something that can be contained by the adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of consistently shifting geographical and political points, corresponding to the shifts and maneuvers of Soviet policy, which cannot be charmed or talked out of existence. A good portion of this chapter is devoted to evaluating the intelligence community's effectiveness in evaluating Soviet capabilities during the course of the Cold War. Lowenthal notes that for the intelligence community, the Soviet Union was the enemy that we came to know and love. There was a certainty and a rhythm to our Cold War relations that was oddly comforting for those whose careers were largely occupied with intelligence during the Cold War. There was a sense of what the military described as mission focus, where you have a very clear idea of what you're doing and why, where the mission is self-evident and easily justified, and hence abundantly funded. How would you contrast the sense of comforting certainty with how you might imagine that the intelligence community views their place within the foreign policy establishment today? Do you think that they are as secure as they were during the Cold War, when we clearly faced this ongoing existential threat? Another important insight that Lowenthal emphasizes in this chapter is the nature of the Soviet system itself and the Russian tradition of maskirovka, which referred to the secretive nature of the Russian state even in the time of the Tsars. The idea of Potemkin villages kind of goes back all the way to the Tsars, where they were trying to persuade the world that they were modernizing. In one sense, I think it's likely that the states that will most likely draw the sustained attention of the intelligence community will continue to be closed authoritarian systems. But how has this system of studying Soviet parades to get a sense of the size and capabilities of the Red Army impacted the intelligence community's approach to intelligence? One thing that we know is that the intelligence community has emphasized statistical intelligence. Now, the problem with statistical analysis can be boiled down to the phrase counting things versus things that count. In other words, you have to know that what you're counting matters in the way that you think it matters in order for your statistics to be valid. Lowenthal argues that the intelligence community did a pretty good job of creating estimates of Soviet military capabilities, but that the IC's estimates of the Soviet economic performance were much less accurate. So why do you think that there was this variance between in the intelligence community's performance, evaluation of military capabilities? Why was that more accurate than their evaluation of the Soviet economic performance? Probably because they didn't have a lot of economists in the intelligence community. What Lowenthal is really suggesting is that the more esoteric the intelligence community's attempts to measure the threat posed by the Soviet Union and its allies, the less they were capturing the ineffable qualities, the intangibles that were essential for getting a clear picture of what was going on in the Soviet Union. Another important factor that Lowenthal notes is that despite the sense of mutual understanding, American and Russian political elites really didn't understand one another that well. And he uses the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 as an illustration of that mutual incomprehension. Think about some of the context surrounding the decision. You had a Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, who had been in power for 15 years, had constructed this elaborate cult of personality surrounding himself. but who was in really bad health. From 1971 forward, he'd had a series of strokes. He'd had his first heart attack in 1975. He was not in good shape, and we know that physical health affects mental health as well. For the Soviet leadership, Afghanistan was a neighboring nation. It's clearly within its within its sphere of influence, shared a border with the Soviet Union. In retrospect, they believed that the global community just wouldn't care, that they would, it would be a fait accompli, no problem. Brezhnev felt like he understood Richard Nixon, who was obviously the previous president. I don't think he recognized that the transition from Nixon to Carter, or from Nixon to Ford to Carter, was a real serious change in how American leadership was acting. And looking again at the U.S. reaction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, you also can't underestimate the impact of the Iranian Revolution, which had taken place in April of 1979, while the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan took place in December the same year. Another issue that I think is important for this chapter is the collapse of the Soviet Union. It clearly took the intelligence community by surprise. Although there had been numerous analyses that pointed to the corruption and the inefficiencies inherent in the Soviet system. Should we view the failure of the intelligence community to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union as a kind of intelligence failure? To me, that's a tough and somewhat uncharitable evaluation. It's fairly easy to see the conditions that exist that might facilitate a revolution. It's really hard to see those conditions coalescing in a way that actually make it feasible for a regime to be brought down. Remember, political regimes exist to resist being overthrown. So what actually caused the Soviet Union to collapse? For conservatives, it was the aggressive opposition of the Reagan administration to Soviet expansion, the Reagan doctrine in Central and Latin America, deploying Pershing II missiles to Europe, and proposing the Star Wars anti-ballistic defense system that he believed would render nuclear missiles obsolete. A lot of folks on the conservative side say this was the pressure that pushed the Russian system into collapse. Liberals tend to put a lot more weight on the impact of Mikhail Gorbachev and say his attempts to reform the system just revealed how brittle the system was. That in reforming it, he demonstrated that there was a crisis of ideology in Russia that couldn't sustain the Soviet system. Finally, there is the current environment, right, with the nation states as they exist today. I would say clearly today that the intelligence community is refocusing its intentions on Russia. I would say that China's efforts to use industrial espionage to steal high technology continue to be a serious cause for concern and occupy a lot of the intelligence community's time. North Korea's nuclear aspirations represent a major potential destabilizing factor. Finally, you've got failed states like Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria. These are disruptive factors in vital regions like the Middle East and Africa. And failed states create sanctuaries for non-state actors like terrorist groups to rest, train, retool. And they facilitated the movement of things like narcotics and arms trafficking. Failed states represent a major nexus point where the intelligence community focuses simultaneously on nation states because of the chaos and because of the other kinds of transnational activities that take place. So hopefully I've given you a lot to think about. I think there's a lot in this chapter. As always, if you have any questions, please throw them out in the forum, and hopefully either I or one of your fellow students can provide an answer. Let's have a great discussion this week.